Hello again. This is the last time you'll see me. This is a kind of a different type of talk, and I didn't fine tune all of it until I got here. Chris taught me that it's okay to do that. But the title that I came up with is Are We Alone? Now, if you had seen the title advertised, you probably thought you were coming to hear a talk about UFOs. It is not at all. The most you'll hear about it is what I just said. But this question of are we alone is very intriguing to me. And I gave a talk at Appleton, Calvary, some time back, titled Israel Alone. And the point was, I started to think about some things a little differently. You know, with Israel, thinking about them being alone in the world, which is prophesied. I mean, it's coming. Even the United States will turn its back on Israel, or at least not be available. That's kind of hard to take. It's kind of hard to think about. But if we think about it as this is the way God meant for things to be and the way He meant for them to end, then it's okay. I trust Him fully. I trust Him with every area of my life, fully. And so, especially as the world has gotten as crazy as it is, you know, we talked about gender confusion. I read a while back that there are credible reports that the U.S. government is going to try to block some of the sun's rays so they can cool the planet. I don't know that I've heard anything scarier than that. That may be the worst one yet. And then there's just odd, goofy things. Like on the way here this week, I read a headline that made me laugh out loud, really. It was about a cargo plane in New York City that took off for Belgium. And on board was a horse. The horse is restrained, of course, in the back of the plane. Well, fairly soon into the flight, the horse breaks his restraints. And he's just loose. So they fortunately were still not too far out. They came back, deplaned everything. But when I saw the headline, runaway horse causes plane to turn around, I thought, of course he did. Of course. 20 years ago, you would have thought, what? We heard crazy things then, a few times a decade, and nothing that really rocked our world, if we're honest. Not like today. Today, it's daily. You wake up and the world is crazy. But as I keep mentioning, and I think is one of the themes of this conference, prophecy is proof that God exists. And so to this question of are we alone? Because, God makes promises to us in Scripture. I'm going to read some of those. That's what I'm here for. Promises to us as nations, but also as individuals. Because share some things with you that I think we can have confidence in. And one thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to break a rule of mine. I normally do not like appropriating verses, especially prophecies meant for the Jews, and applying them to the church or Christians. But I think that it's also obvious we have some leeway to make our life application with some of this stuff. And I think I have a big conviction that in the story of Israel, and I mean the whole sweep of Jewish history, from Abraham to the end, is proof that God exists. Clear proof. And so that's what I want to emphasize with this talk today. But to start, I want to tell you a story. I've never told this story in public, and I don't talk about my personal life ever. I always joke that I don't talk to myself about myself. That's how much I hate it. But this seems to fit today. Several years ago, I love history, and so I bought an antique rifle. You know what they say, it seemed like a good idea at the time. And I bought it only because it was going to be a conversation piece. It was a historical piece. And the reason that I bought it was a German Mauser made in 1890 for the Ottoman Turks. Had Arabic writing, it was so cool. Bolt action. And so in my head, in the movie in my head, it's at least plausible that this weapon was used in Palestine at Beersheba against the British, against Allenby's forces. That's what I told myself. So I bought it. $318. And a little bit out of character for me. Well, it was out of character to buy it to begin with. I'm Jack Benny. If you remember Jack Benny, how frugal he is. But also out of character, I wanted to say I'd shot the gun just one time, just to say I had, because again, the movie in my head, the last person that fired it was firing at British troops as the British were about to take down the Ottoman Empire in Palestine and pave the way for the Jewish state. And then me. And I would be the last one to fire the gun. So I took it out the very next morning. I live out in the country, out there by myself with my dog that takes on squirrels. And I took it out before I started my day of work. And I put one round through it and woke up 2 days later in the hospital because the gun just blew up in my face. Now, I just said I was alone out there. We don't even have a lot of close neighbors. And at 8:30 in the morning, there wasn't anybody around. I was alone, except I wasn't, because I drove myself to the hospital. And I don't remember anything about that day at all. Nothing. And the doctor told me I probably never will. I don't want to. But of course, the blast knocked me off my feet. Now, I think the reason I got up off the ground is the same reason I drove 5 miles to the hospital unconscious. God was with me. I wasn't alone. I've never been alone in my whole life, in that sense. And so they patched me up there and then air vac'd me to a bigger hospital. And so that began my 3-month wait for a reconstructive surgeon. And I was getting pretty nervous because my other doctors, and this kind of injury required a team of doctors. Well, the first guys I dealt with, eye doctor, ear, nose, and throat, they weren't exactly warm, fuzzy, optimistic guys. So I'm like, I can't stay this way. I won't go into the detail, but it was a gruesome injury. And so, lo and behold, though, I still wasn't alone in this because God brought me a world-class reconstructive surgeon. So I had to wait several weeks to meet him, so I go for the initial appointment, and I go in the little room, and pretty soon he comes in, and he sat down opposite me. I didn't greet him. I didn't say boo. I looked at him. I said, "Are you going to be able to fix me?" And he said, "Oh, yeah." Just like that. Just like that. I was expecting another doctor to tell me, "Well, we can't guarantee anything and we can't be sure, et cetera, et cetera." He just waved his hand. He said, "Of course we'll fix you." All my stress went away. And so the day came for that surgery, and I went up the night before, so Springfield, Missouri, stayed in a hotel. The next morning at 6 o'clock, I walked in the front door of the hospital to get ready for pre-op. And at the point that they're going to wheel me back for surgery, I'm laying in this bed, and my doctor comes over, and I had developed this dumb joke that I used with all the doctors and nurses and everything every time I went for an appointment. And the joke was what I said to him. I said, "Listen, I've thought this over. I don't want to spare any expense. I don't want the Buddy Hackett face. Give me the Steve McQueen face." And he just kind of patted my arm and he says, "Well, I'll see what we can do." Well, I didn't end up with a Steve McQueen face, but they put me back together enough that I'm just fine. I do just fine. There was another outcome, a little detail that has become a big detail to me. I think about it, if not every day, multiple times a week. And that is that my right eye, the damaged eye, was by far my dominant eye. It was the stronger of the two. He left me with a weaker eye. God left me with a weaker eye. But there was a lesson in that for me. 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. If he had left me with a dominant eye, I would have been just conceited enough that I wouldn't have relied on him 100% of the time like I do now. I really believe this. And so I don't think about it in a negative way. I think about it in an amazing way. He sustains me every day. He sustains me like he sustains the whole planet. All the time. So I do whatever I want to do. I go where I want to go. For these conferences, you always fly. But the last time I went to Appleton, it's a 12-hour drive from my house, and I thought, you know what? I'm going to see if I can do this because of the vision thing. I made it just fine. Lovely drive there, lovely drive back. So I can do whatever I want to do. God preserved my life because he's merciful. And so let me get into the body of this talk. Being able to do what I want also allows me to go to Israel from time to time. I'm going for the first time on a tour next spring with Chris. I've been I know, Elijah said he's sorry. I'm not kidding. These two, I have to decompress when I get home. No, they're great guys. I'm going on a tour for the first time. I've been 10 times. Never been on a tour. I just always go myself and rent a car and drive around. But I'm really looking forward to this. And there's, if you want to go, there's information on the table back there. But I went to Israel in May. And this thing about aloneness is on my mind a lot now, but in a good way. The world suffers from loneliness. Individuals do. We all know people that do. In a room this size, there's lonely people. And you look fine. You say, I'm fine. Somebody asks you, but you're not fine. Because here's the thing. The rubber meets the road when you're flat on your back in the middle of the night and you're staring at the ceiling, right? You're alone in some way because there's a problem in your life. There's something insurmountable that you can't manage and you can't solve on your own. And yet if you're like I used to be, I would just turn stuff over and over and over in my mind to death, trying to figure out a way out of it. That's what we do. But I want to talk now a bit about the story of Israel and the miracles that God has brought to them from 4,000 years ago to right now. And in that story, I want you to see that you are not alone. You never have been. Because we all have the ability to call on the name of the Lord in distress. And my point in all this is, at the end, I hope you take away, if God can act on a stage this big in front of the whole world, keeping the Jews alive in their national life again, He can solve your problems. Career jeopardy, money problems, you're estranged from your kids, your marriage is in need of some help, on and on and on. A lot of us, humans have, in essence, the same issues. Whatever your problem is, I challenge you, when you leave this conference, when you go home tonight, I challenge you, call on the name of the Lord, tell Him what you need, He will come to you. In Deuteronomy 31:8, it says, the Lord Himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. That verse, that dialogue, came 3,700 years ago when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness with Moses. This is God's promise to them. It is still active. It's going to continue to be active all the way to the end. But if you want to allow yourself today to embrace this promise for yourself and for your own life, wherever you are, please do that. There's a very famous story you all know. 1 Samuel 17:37, David said, the Lord who delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. David was not like the people around him, at least that day. The whole Israelite army was on one hill, separated by a short valley from the Philistine army on another hill. Every one of the Israelites felt alone and afraid. David did not. As a young man, the story in Scripture, which, as you know by now, I believe happened exactly as it's written. It happened in history. The story says that once David made the decision to go down into the valley of decision and face this evil, scary warrior who had spent 40 days in the morning and evening coming out and taunting the Israelites, taunting Saul, the king. When David decided he was going to take him on, he ran toward Saul. They tried to give him the armor. They tried to give him all this stuff. He said, I can't use this stuff. He said, the battle is the Lord's. And you know what he did? So, in May, when I was in Israel, believe it or not, after all those times, that's one place I had never seen, Valley of Elah. So I thought, I can do this. I got GPS. And so I headed out, and south of Latrine, on Highway 38, I'm driving south. Now, you know, the Israelis are really, I love the Israelis. A lot of people say, oh, they're so hard to get to know, and they're kind of cranky and all this kind of. To paraphrase Will Rogers, I've never met a Jew I didn't like. Never met an Israeli I didn't like. They just have such an interesting manner about them. And so, you know, unlike us, especially where I live near Branson, Missouri. There was no cheesy billboards. There was no weird theme parks of David and Goliath. And I don't know what I was expecting. I guess I thought there was going to be a fiberglass Goliath on the side of the highway to show me this is the spot. Because I thought, well, I can just get close, and then, of course, there's going to be signage. No, there wasn't. So I actually drove up the hill to a convenience store, and I get out of the car, and there's this old Israeli guy sitting in a white plastic chair, and he's seen guys like me coming 1,000 times. He gets up before I even approached him. I said, hey, look, I'm looking for David and Goliath. He goes, yeah, I know. You know how they talk. He walks me over to this overlook, and he goes, now go back the way you came. There's the highway. And as you start around the curve, start looking to the right, and you're going to see a dry stream bed. He said, that's the stream bed. And my mind exploded. Can you imagine? You're here. You're in the place where it took place. I'm just like, wow. He said, look for the stream bed, and then you continue on around a curve a little bit, and you can pull off on the shoulder, and there's a footpath you can walk. And that's exactly what I did. I couldn't believe I'm here. I was standing here, and the hill where the Israelites were encamped is right here. And across this valley, which is, I kind of got a chuckle out of this because the highway goes right through it. I think they must have met in the middle of the highway. Across the valley is the hill of the Philistines to the west. It's all just right there. And I got out, and I'm walking behind the hill of the Israelite encampment. And I got up there, and there's only one other tour group. It was actually a Hispanic tour group. And it was so cool. We just stood there together and listened to the guide for a while. And I had a little bit of an ulterior motive, though, because I was standing there just waiting because, you know, you're going to have to get a stone, right, out of the dry stream bed. It's probably theft. I hope I don't get a call from the foreign ministry at some point. Remember the Johnny Cash song, I Took It One Piece at a Time? He stole a whole vehicle from Detroit automaker because he did it little by little. I took it one piece at a time. I took 5 pieces and put them in my suitcase because the scripture tells us that David picked up 5 smooth stones. And I stood there in that stream bed. I don't cry ever, but I did. because David wasn't alone at all. And his awareness of that gave him the impetus to run toward Goliath. Killed him with one shot. The kill shot was a limestone rock, and believe me, this thing right here, if that came off a sling at your forehead, he crushed Goliath's skull. It reminded me of Benziah Netanyahu, the father, the patriarch of the Netanyahu family, Bibi's father, Jonathan's father, Edo's father. All three sons served in the Syriat Matkal, Israel's elite counterterrorism unit. And in fact, I brought 5 copies of a DVD called Follow Me, which I'm going to give away. Do the sign up, get the card off the table, go to the page, sign up. You'll be eligible to get a copy of the DVD. It's about the Entebbe operation, but also the background of the Netanyahu family. And at one point early on, they were interviewing Benziah, who was by this time 100. He lived to be 102. Lived in Jerusalem for 70 years. He outlived his oldest son by 40 years. But they were asking him about Jonathan, who led the assault team at Entebbe, and who was the only Israeli soldier that fell, the only casualty. The Israeli cabinet, in approving that rescue operation, figured they would take 20% casualties, which meant 40 IDF commandos would be dead or injured. They lost 1. But anyway, they asked Benziah about Jonathan, and he said he always jumped into the danger point. He had that kind of courage that David had. So there's the ancient account of an Israelite victory. God was with them that day because he was with a single shepherd boy that believed that he wasn't alone. He said, the battle is the Lord's. Whatever you're facing, the battle is the Lord's. And I was, Chris and I have talked about this. I also that day visited the battlefield at Latrun and the Armored Tank Corps Museum. And there's an old military building that the British used. And I think that museum is the biggest tank museum in the world. There's hundreds of tanks on this hillside. And in the middle of it is this building. And you can go up the stairs on the side and you can get on the top, the roof that's flat, and you can see forever. What the Who said, I can see for miles. You could see for miles. And I'm standing on that roof, and I stood there for a long time. And I thought about one thing. Just below me was the battlefield at Latrun, where Sharon fought the Arabs in the War of Independence, Ariel Sharon. Across the valley, which seemed as far as you could see, the valley of Ayalon, is where Joshua fought the Amorites. Joshua was the only commander the Israelites had, like David, who knew he wasn't alone and wasn't afraid of the people that inhabited the land. And he went after them. And that day, and I don't care one whit that the scoffers think this is a stupid, crazy story. As it was getting near evening, Joshua asked God for more daylight to finish off the enemy because he was going after them. I have no trouble believing that God granted his request because that's what the Bible tells me happened. But I was standing there watching. I was looking at the whole battlefield. Joshua to Sharon. And the Jews are still there. And the Amorites in the Jordanian League that Sharon fought against are gone. They're gone forever. This concept that Israel has been alone, but they're really not. There's story after story after story. Chris knows them. Hundreds at least stories of miraculous things that happened to the Israeli army in the last 75 years. And I defy you to read about it and conclude there is no God. If you think there's no God after reading the modern history of the state of Israel, you don't want to believe, because it will astonish you. We just passed the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, the 73 October War in Israel. You know, because we're all human, they had won this literally miraculous victory in the Six-Day War in 67. They took on 3 full neighboring armies and shattered them. They didn't just win. They shattered the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and the Syrians. They warned Jordan, don't get into this fight. Our fight is not with you. It's with Nasser in Egypt. It's with Assad in Syria. Stay out. They did it anyway, and they lost the heartland. They lost the biblical heartland of Israel to the Israelis, who hold it now permanently. God said in Amos 9:15, when I bring you back for the final time, you'll never be uprooted again. So these stories, these news magazine stories, will Israel survive? Can Israel survive? Come on. That's ridiculous. Israel is eternal. But, you know, after 6 years of feeling pretty full of yourself about this miraculous 6-day war victory, the Israelis were a little bit complacent. They'll tell you that. And nobody in the Middle East, nobody anywhere, the West didn't believe the Arabs would attack again, because they're just going to get creamed again. So that's exactly what the Arabs did. On the night of October 6th, the eve of Yom Kippur, which is the holiest day on the Jewish calendar, it's the Day of Atonement. Nothing happens in Israel. You'll be there and there's not a car moving. There's nobody outside. People stay inside. And they reflect on their lives. And everybody's at home. But guess what? You know, they had the Sinai Peninsula, thank goodness, because of the 6-day war. So the Israelis had that. So the border with Egypt was the Suez Canal. Well, Sadat of Egypt wanted the Sinai back. And when he said he wanted it back, they should have believed him. So that night, 500 Israeli soldiers with 3 tanks looked out. There were 600,000 Egyptians, 2,000 tanks, 550 fighter aircraft. And immediately 1,000 Egyptian tanks poured into the Sinai. The Israeli positions were completely overrun. In the north, the Syrians poured 1,400 tanks over the Golan Heights to meet 180 Israeli tanks. If anybody ever thought the Israelis were alone, it was right then. They thought it. Moshe Dayan, the defense minister, went to Golda Meir, the prime minister, and he said, the the third commonwealth is in danger, meaning the third sovereign entity of the Jews is in danger. He thought they were going down. He wanted to use nukes. He was serious. He wanted to use battlefield nukes. The situation was that dire. So this was what was arrayed against them. They had to mobilize immediately. Reservists left their homes. They literally jumped in their vehicles and drove to the front. They put on their battle gear on the fly, and they went straight to the front. They went straight to the Sinai to engage the Egyptians. They went straight to the north to engage the Syrians. Now, wars in Israel, or wars in the Middle East typically don't usually take a long time. There are exceptions, the Iran-Iraq war, but usually they're over fairly quick. And this one went on for about 3 weeks. And all Israel had managed to do was achieve basically a stalemate, but they could still lose the war. Ariel Sharon, who had retired in the spring as an active general, major general, he was on his sheep farm in the Negev desert. He went straight to the front. He went down to fight the Egyptians like he'd been fighting them since he was a teenager. And Sharon was a little bit of a loose cannon, a little bit of a character. He always was. But, probably every army needs at least one Sharon. And so the rest of them are trying to figure out what to do. How are we going to break through and win this war? The cabinet was meeting. The top brass were meeting, Central Command, Northern Command, Southern Command. And Sharon had cooked up this plan that seemed pretty harebrained at the time. And he was trying to get anybody to pay attention to him. And for about a week, everybody just said, get out of here. Eric was his nickname. Eric is crazy. Thank you very much. His plan, he finally went to Golda Meir, and he said, there's a window of time and there's a place right here at the canal. But the window is closing. But we can build a pontoon bridge across the canal. And we can defeat the Egyptian army. Egypt's vaunted Third Army was on the other side of the canal. They were going to be the ones to finish off the Jewish state as soon as Sadat told them to. And so finally, when you're so desperate, all right, Eric is crazy, but we don't really have an option here. Israeli engineers built a pontoon bridge across the Suez Canal at night. And when it was finished, Sharon poured tanks and artillery and men across it all night long. And the next morning, it was kind of a fog, a haze out, and visibility was very limited. But at 10:30 in the morning, the fog lifted, and Egypt's Third Army looked up on the high ground, and they were surrounded by Sharon's forces. Then he radioed back to Central Command, and he says, I've encircled Third Army, and I'm going to kill it. Well, then, of course, the Russians and the Americans and everybody else gets involved, and they hammer out a ceasefire. They don't work on ceasefires if Israel's losing and needs the help, but they'll work on a ceasefire if the enemy is in danger. So the war ended, and Sharon saved the country. And I was telling these guys a story the other day. What's going on in Gaza right now is really, obviously, very bad. It's a catastrophe. And it will go down as the greatest catastrophe in Israel's modern history. It will even eclipse, I believe, the Yom Kippur War. But I was talking to a retired Israeli diplomat one day. We were having lunch in Jerusalem. And he had known Sharon. And this was about 2007 or 8. So this is 2 or 3 years after Israel had pulled out of Gaza. And conservatives had said, this is going to be a disaster. Well, unfortunately, they were proven right. But at the time, Israel thought that's what they should do. And Sharon was prime minister by that time, and he spearheaded the withdrawal of 8,000 Israeli citizens from the Sinai, or from Gaza. And I'm certain that if Sharon were here today, he would be grief-stricken. But I asked this diplomat, and I thought I knew the answer very well, because I'd heard a lot of people condemning Sharon for this. And I said, so what do you think about Sharon? I mean, pulling out of Gaza, what do you think about that? I was expecting him to say, yeah, he's a bum and he's endangering us and everything. He said, no. He said, listen, in 1973, Sharon gave us our life and our nation. He had a different perspective. The point is, in these stories, at the moment that it looks like Israel is abandoned, God is there, and he delivers them miraculously. I read a fascinating little quick story a couple of weeks ago, and it was an Israeli soldier now fighting in Gaza, and he said he was part of the group that went immediately to the south when the word came down of what was happening with Hamas. And he said, we were getting into trucks, and they were literally handing us our weapons, handing us our rifles. They don't have time to check them. They don't have time to. He said they knew they were loaded. That was it, or he hoped they were loaded. It was that fast. The situation was that desperate. So he said they go down to Gaza, and they get out. They immediately engage the Hamas terrorists in battle. And he said they eliminated many terrorists that day. And he said, you know what? My weapon worked flawlessly. He said, every time I pulled the trigger, it did what I wanted it to do. But when they got back to base, they were going to break down their weapons, they were going to clean them, reload. He said, I discovered that my rifle was defective. It had always been defective. He said the thing was broken when they handed it to me. And yet, when he needed it on the battlefield against an enemy as vile as their ancient enemies, it worked to perfection. Israel is never alone. And again, and I want to end with this, I implore you to understand and internalize that if God will save the Jews on the scale that he's done and is doing at this moment, because they will defeat Hamas, he will take care of your problems. Psalm 34:18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the contrite of spirit. Psalm 68:5, a father of the fatherless and a protector of the widows is God in his holy habitation. Scripture is so detailed. Every conceivable problem you will ever have in your life is found in Scripture. And the solutions are there. Look at the detail. How many people didn't have a father growing up? His fault, nobody's fault. Perhaps he died early. Perhaps he abandoned you. I know that imprints on a child, and it causes problems later in life. What does God promise here? I will be your father. A father to the fatherless. You're never alone. Psalm 62:1-2, my soul waits in silence on God alone. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my refuge. I will not be greatly shaken. Only the Lord is your sustenance. Take the books from the celebrity pastors and throw them in a dumpster. They have no value at all. Scripture alone is your guide. God alone is your refuge. Joel 2:25. Another one that is really speaking to the Jewish people specifically, but again, we're going to suspend my rule for a little bit. You can certainly apply this to your life, and I think you'll see it has relevance. I will restore to you the years the locust had eaten. That's one of the most beautiful passages in all of Scripture. God is saying, I will restore to you what was taken from you. And the image is of a locust. They just destroy whole crops. They just strip it all bare. He's saying, if that has happened to you in your life, whatever your locust moment was, your marriage blew up, somebody died, a friendship was irreparably broken, you lost all your money, you can't get a job interview and you have bills to pay, you call on the name of the Lord and He'll restore to you what was taken from you. And that's not word of faith theology. It's a promise from God. Now here is the kicker for me that speaks directly to this. Matthew 11:28. I repeat this one often. I read this every single day. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That is a direct quote from Jesus Christ, who created you. It's foolproof. Notice what he doesn't say. Come to me if you want to, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Maybe. No. 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 I'm going to tell you something. I normally don't say this. But there are times, even in Scripture, we're told we can put God to the test over something. If you have one of those problems I described, and you think you're alone, and you don't have any way out, I want you to go home, and tonight, when you're staring at the ceiling, I want you to say Matthew 11:28 out loud. I want you to answer Jesus and tell Him that you need His help. I want you to tell Him that you're tired and burdened and weary. He will come to you. Because people that call on the Lord and depend on the Lord are never alone. Watch Him bring that miracle that you didn't think was possible. And again, you think, well, wait a minute, buddy. Let me tell you about my problem, which is unique, and nobody in the history of the human race has ever had this problem. Come on. Whatever the issue is, I want you to remember what the Lord has done for His people in the past and what He's doing for them right now. John 16:33, these things I have spoken unto you, that in me ye might have peace. In the world ye shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Isn't that beautiful? And it's true. Finally, Acts 17:28. In Him we live and move and have our being. If your problems are too big 600,000 Egyptians, 2,000 tanks, 550 aircraft against 500 Israeli soldiers with 3 tanks. And Israel won. Don't ever forget that. Thank you.